The conclusion that I'd like to reach and sum up about the course we've taken, the path we've trod, as it were, is twofold, or actually threefold, I should say. First, I want to sum up some of the critical questions that we've raised. Questions about the epistemological nature of history, questions about the status of historical knowledge, historical inquiry, and the sort of truth, if any, that history offers. Then I want to return to some of the substantive issues that I promised to address from the beginning and hope I have throughout. And I want to argue there that there are fundamentally two visions or two modes of historical understanding. And I want to suggest what hangs on the choices one way or the other. And then finally, I want to address some pragmatic issues, issues of the value of historical knowledge, what, from either perspective or from any perspective, history must mean for us, and why we must, to the extent that we must, come to terms with the human past. But to begin with, the epistemological or critical questions. It seems to me that recent developments in the philosophy of science have rendered the old question, which 19th century and Enlightenment figures struggled with about whether history was a science or not, that recent developments in the philosophy of science have made that question obsolete. We now know that science is not, in fact, unified by one particular method. It is true that there is a formal mathematical method that underlines the techniques and explanations found in physics, to some extent in chemistry. But that one does not find those same sorts of mathematical laws in botany, and yet no one denies that botany is a science. One does not find it in geology. No one denies geology is a science. One does not find it in many parts of biology. In some parts we do, in molecular biology and microbiology, but we don't find it throughout biology. Anatomy doesn't have those sorts of laws. So the notion that there is exactly one and only one form of science is no longer held seriously by philosophers of science, and therefore the question of whether history fills such a singular univocal sort of conceptual construction seems to me obsolete. What we now believe about science, or at least many philosophers do since the writing of Thomas Kuhn, is that science is a paradigmatic discipline, which is to say it works through the constructions of models. Models about how various physical processes work. And that what makes scientific progress possible is an agreement on those paradigms, on those models, and of the techniques that are demarcated within those models for solving the still existing puzzles or riddles. So, in that sense, what we might say characterizes science is being paradigmatic, is having some shared conception of what are the fundamental issues, what are the fundamental problems, and what are the fundamental acceptable ways in which those problems can be addressed and solved. To that extent, it is fair to say history is, for the most part, a pre-paradigmatic discipline. There are things that are close to paradigms for history. I would argue Weberian sociology is to some extent paradigmatic. Idealism is something like a paradigm, between a paradigm and a philosophy. And of course Marxism is about as close as one gets to a paradigm in the historical sciences, or in the historical discipline. In fact, we have to acknowledge history employs a wide variety of techniques and strategies of interpretation, analysis, and explanation. It is not the case that all histories are stories and narratives. We saw that with Brodel. Some histories are, in fact, sociological models. Some take the form not of stories, but of a series of statistical tables. So there's a variety of different historical techniques. Some histories take the form of genealogical graphs, family trees. Some are extended essays on the meaning of some particular phenomena, which rarely ever use tense sentences. Though, for the most part, most historians are storytellers. So what we need to understand there is that there is no one historical method any more than there is one scientific method. There's a variety of techniques that fall within the domain of science, and a variety of practices, explanatory as well as discursive, which characterize the historical discipline. Well, I don't want to suggest then that there are no good questions of an epistemological nature. We can ask different questions which seem to me much more pointed and much more significant. Rather than ask whether history is a science, let's ask whether history can be relatively scientific. And make that judgment relative to other disciplines. Is history more or less scientific, say, than economics, classical economics, neoclassical economics? Is history more or less scientific than, say, anthropology, sociology? Is it more or less scientific than literary criticism? Placing it in that perspective gives us the degree or the sense to which, the extent to which history embodies the principles of a scientific discipline. And that has some importance for us. So the absolute question as to whether history is a science can always be begged by the other question of whether science is even a science. Is botany really a science? Is biology really a science? And in fact, I would point out that by the old canons, the positivist canons of science as an absolute system, Karl Popper was led to conclude that evolutionary theory was not in fact scientific. It could not produce laws, mathematical formulas, was not empirically falsifiable, and therefore it was a heuristic, poetic guide to a future science. Well, one question then, whether history can be relatively scientific, and if so, relative to what other disciplines? Another question, which seems to me important and valuable question, one which admits of a variety of different responses. Whether some sorts of history are more scientific than others. Is an idealist history more scientific than a formist history, than a history which just comments and vividly describes the uniqueness of various events? Isn't there more sort of unification of explanatory scheme with principles and ideas as opposed to just noting how incredibly unique and American the revolution was, unlike anything else, and just a lot of vivid descriptions of scenes at various town greens? Is a Weberian history more scientific than an idealist one which taxonomizes the possible relations among various sorts of authorities, individuals, institutions, and cultures? Is a Marxist history more scientific than a narrative history, one which begins with general principles and to some extent offers law-like interpretations of the past, one which, given certain initial conditions, one can deduce what should have happened in some given case? So clearly, Marxism is not a science. Weber is not a science. Idealism is not a science to the same extent that quantum physics is scientific. But are those sorts of disciplines more scientific than other sorts of practices of history? Is Marxism more scientific? Is Weber more scientific than straight old narrative storytelling? Than what White calls contextualism and formism? And finally, there's a third critical and epistemological question that I think is rarely asked and has to be asked. Let's assume that certain of those disciplines are more scientific than other approaches to history. Do we even want a scientific history? Is that even desirable? Do we want a history which shows us law-like explanation, or do we come to history perhaps for something else, to understand the unique flavor that describes a particular sort of culture? When we want an explanation of the American history, do we necessarily want a clear causal analysis that gives us the law-like nature of what must have caused and only could have caused the American Revolution? Or do we want, when we look at that, to know what makes us different as Americans? What is it about the Revolution that makes us proud, ashamed, or indifferent about our past, present, and future? Is a history that produces laws one that's interesting? Do we want from history more moral judgment? Treating history naturalistically as a science, there is one basic principle. One does not moralize about nature. Right? No one considers lions evil because they eat gazelles. Lions eat gazelles because that's in their nature. Do we want a history like that? Do we want a history that doesn't allow us to moralize? Treating history as a science might preclude our moralization. Would we want a scientific description of the causes of the Second World War that reduce it simply to an imbalance of powers created by the failure of Britain to recognize the greatness of Germany and that failure of recognition in the Treaty of Versailles? That in fact, the First World War was really the Second World War with a brief break? That it was one big world war and a break? Is that bearable for us? Is that why we go to history? Or do we perhaps not go to a history of the Second World War because we have to do something psychologically about the fact that roughly 12 million people were mass murdered and untold millions more died in a huge, dramatic struggle? Don't we, in fact, want to have an account that tells us, perhaps, that, no, the cause of the Second World War was an absolute maniacal madman and his insane lust for power? And in fact, exactly those sorts of debates do occur over the Second World War. Two scholars I would point out, A.J.P. Taylor, wrote a book on the origins of the Second World War, which is an attempt to be scientific. And he argues if it hadn't been for Hitler, if the German government had been headed by a liberal or a socialist, we'd have had the Second World War anyways. It was inevitable. It was a result of the fact that the First World War had not decisively concluded the problems of balance of power within Europe, and that Hitler acted like, despite his insane maniacism and racism, he acted like any other head of the German state would have. The structural situation dictated it. Alan Bullock found that frightening, right? Because he wrote at a time not long after the Second World War where we didn't necessarily want a scientific understanding. We come to history, as Nietzsche would say, with human needs. And our needs were not only explanation, but somehow comprehension, which science does not necessarily offer in that way. We wanted a comprehension that create a moral order out of a chaotic set of events. Okay, so those strike me as the more important critical issues. The critical issues which emerge to, I think, the modern mind in the late 20th century, whether history can be relatively scientific, whether some sorts of history are more scientific than others, and whether, in fact, a scientific history is even desirable in the first place, and if so, why? Whatever the answer to any of these questions, it strikes me that to deny that history offers some sort of knowledge is not only counterintuitive, in that we all feel somehow that it does, but it's absurd. If history doesn't give us knowledge about the United States of America, what in heaven's name would? Okay, so history obviously does give us some kind of knowledge. If history doesn't give us knowledge, then why, when people ask us, do we dress the way we do we tell them about something in our past? Why do you live where you do? Why, when we answer that, do we say, well, I was brought up there? Okay, so clearly history must offer us some kind of knowledge. Okay, I now want to turn to the major fish I'd like to fry, which are the two modes of historical understanding. And it strikes me that historical analysis over the last few hundred years has generated essentially two different visions, two different interpretive strategies, and two different explanations. One is idealist, and the other is naturalist. Each of these systems are internally consistent. They each account for all the phenomena that arise within them systematically. And they're also coherent. They never contradict themselves at any point. It strikes me that both of these have virtues, different virtues, and different vices. And it strikes me that they both respond to different human propensities and needs. Different things that we want out of history are answered by these different sorts of modes of interpretation. In fact, I would call these two modes what one philosopher has termed essentially contestable concepts. Well, I would say these are essentially contestable modes of interpretation. That both of them will account for the past, both of them are internally consistent, both of them generate virtues and vices, and the choice between them really is an existential choice. It's a moral choice. And it's fundamentally a human choice, because which mode of analysis we will choose for the past will tell us more than anything else about how we think of ourselves as a species, about how we characterize ourselves as humans, animals, people, and spiritual entities. So what I'd like to do briefly now is present to you the vision of each of these schools. And I'm going to try and do, as I have in the past, do this internally. So I'm going to give you a brief period in which I will try to personify the virtues and wisdom of the idealist perspective. and naturally be quite derogatory towards the naturalist, and then switch hats. Okay. What are the virtues of idealism? We idealists argue that history, humanity, and culture are somehow different than nature. That there's a difference between, say, Albert Einstein and a chimpanzee that knows how to type E equals MC squared on a typewriter. That's the intuitive, obvious point that we idealists cherish. That somehow history, unlike natural science, discloses a different sort of life, a different metaphysical realm. The realm of freedom, of human dignity, of aspiration, and of progress, because nature is by nature static. It doesn't develop. And if it does develop, it develops by blind, dumb laws. Whereas history develops by a growth of awareness, of self-understanding, of rational comprehension. Whether that be thought of in terms of spirit, or mind, or language, or culture, somehow the human species is different from everything else we find in the physical world. And that difference comes down to its development over time. And history is where that is exemplified. So for us idealists, we must recognize that history is the realm of freedom, whether that be thought of as liberty or as Kantian autonomy. History is the realm in which we find an example, a counterexample to the buzzing confusion of one damn thing after another without any sense, rhyme, or reason. There is purpose in history. People do things with motives, with intentions, which cannot be said for microorganisms and other primates. Culture, for we idealists, whether we think of that as mind or language, is more than just sounds. We can train a parrot to say, to know the good is to do the good. But does that mean anything to the parrot? Whereas when Socrates said to know the good is to do the good, it meant something significant. It meant that we could improve human society simply by expanding human knowledge. That our motivation was not a problem, that people always did what they thought was right, and that when they did wrong things, it was because they had had a bad education and a bad training, that their character was a function of their background. When the parrot says to know the good is to do the good, I don't believe he can have that in mind. I don't believe he has a mind. That's the difference. History discloses the realm of culture, not nature. It's a distinct pattern of evolution. It's a distinct pattern of explanation then, and a distinct pattern of understanding we need to grasp that, a pattern not shared by the physicist. It's precisely because culture does not mirror the world, it constitutes the world. If we believe that there are ghosts out in that outer office or in your closet, in a sense, there are. They're part of the mental framework of your life, and you will live your life as if they were there. That makes a huge difference in your world. To believe that there are humors in your body is not a copy of the world, it's an interpretation of it. It will lead to different strategies, but it will also lead to different cognitive states, to a different feeling about the world than if we believe it's the result of infections. Particularly ideas and cultures that refer to the human mind itself. These are essentially constitutive if we believe we are free to choose, free to think what we will, then we are free. When we believe that we have no choices, that is the moment we surrender our freedom, which is why idealism is more than just an interpretive strategy. It's a strategy with a difference. It makes a difference to us in our lives. The belief in idealism creates the freedom which it itself projects. So history, then, is a development according to the dictates, evolutionary dictates, of this medium, of this culture, and of its posits and notions. The difference from a naturalist between Shakespeare and a caveman is just his clothing. But to an idealist, although they may have the same physiognomy, the difference between a caveman, Cro-Magnon, and Shakespeare is every bit as great as the difference between the first Australopithecus afarensis and that Cro-Magnon. That culture is a realm of evolution which increases dramatically and far more profoundly than physiological evolution ever could have. Now, insofar as this development is purely human, idealism expresses the belief that our changes come from ourselves, and this is the essence of freedom. that we have not developed because of some external force, but because of our own internal development. And for that reason, whatever changes have occurred are the result of our own doing. And that is the ultimate source of human dignity. Right? Our technological mastery over nature is not a gift. It's not a result of some external impinging. It's the expression of human genius through science and applied science. And if that is not a source of human dignity, then nothing is. Our belief in universal freedom, our belief in the extension of civil rights and civic participation to ethnic minorities, to women, and to various other economically disadvantaged groups, is not a result of certain causal forces working on us. It's an expansion of the human spirit, of the human mind. Thus, idealism treats history not as a subspecies of the development of geological time, but as something profoundly, probably uniquely meaningful. Nothing has more meaning for we idealists than history itself. History discloses where we are. History discloses the purposes, the ends, the ideas, the principles, the trends towards which human development has been headed. Idealism shows, and there are varieties, in perhaps the growth of human freedom over time, the growth of human rationality, the growth of human community, the expansion of an awareness of our place in the cosmos, perhaps an expansion of our awareness of God and his plans for us. Well, I would point out then that for we idealists, history never follows laws. It develops in a teleological fashion, according to ends, according to principles, and according to purposes, which are in fact the deep structure of human culture, mentality, and mind. Whether that be freedom, whether that be artistic self-representation, whether that be self-awareness. Whatever it is, some such principles certainly must lie behind history. Elsewise, it is simply one damn thing after another, and we have to agree with Henry Ford. It's just bunk. Because only idealism holds out the promise of progress. The idea that somehow there is a trajectory along which human movement has come, and towards which it is headed. And that trajectory is what we mean by progress. We start with a baseline. We have added to it through our growth. And insofar as it teaches us of progress and the possibility of progress, it teaches us that hope may be a virtue, after all. That the belief in a better tomorrow may in fact be not only a psychological salve, but in fact an inducement to greater achievement. That hope and optimism may be the highest expression not only of the human spirit, but of the human potentiality. That it may be what causes us to achieve great things if great things are to be achieved. And in fact, I don't think we can deny that idealist understandings of history have inspired many of the most heroic and admirable acts of our species in recent times. It was the belief in human progress and an idealist conception of history which the transcendentalists drew directly from Hegel and Herder and Kant that inspired the abolitionist movement in the United States. It was a belief in the cult of progressive idealist history that inspired people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mary Wollstonecraft, and others to demand that the freedom of man be extended to woman. It was the belief in the ideal and the idealist interpretation of history as the working out of the project, the teleological project of a comedy of nations, which led people like Woodrow Wilson to insist that we would fight one more war to end all wars. It may not have exceeded, but few things have been as admirable in human history. Few things have inspired us as greatly. It was an idealist understanding of the course of human history that led people like Martin Luther King to struggle for civil rights, to believe that it was possible, because the spirit of man could develop and progress to an even greater degree. It was that faith, that progress, that belief and hope which led him to, quote, have a dream. Again, idealist understandings offer us moral holidays. What do I mean by moral holidays? It's an expression that comes from William James, in which he talks about just such idealist understandings. And he said, all of us are caught up in the uncertainty of what will happen in our futures and in the future of the world. And it's something about which we all care intensely. That can lead to anxiety. We're caught as it were, as boxers fighting against an evil foe, and we can never relax. The belief in progress, in hope, inspired by idealism, allows us to occasionally say, yes, it will work out. I will take a moral holiday for the afternoon. I can relax my muscles a bit. I can cease to be strenuous for a time and enjoy some of my life because I do have a belief that things will work out in the wash. And therefore, it's not only a spur to action, but it's also a reason to release action occasionally and to enjoy some sort of calm. Finally, historical idealism has supplied many people with the courage and the determination to persevere through the most difficult of times. People faced with the most hideous of discriminations, who believe that nonetheless historical progress is inevitable, ceased to become bitter, failed to become angry and violent, and instead persevered. And in fact, that failure to become bitter, angry, and violent may well have led to their success. Mahatma Gandhi, no matter how many times thrown into prison, no matter how many times told by the British that his plan would never work, stuck by his guns, refused to become disillusioned. The fact is, despite overwhelming odds, he did win. And that very success speaks to the strength and the brilliance of idealism, speaks to its perennial appeal, and the reason which we can hardly think to dispense with it or give over to the pessimism and small-minded naturalism of those materialists. Okay, well, that's my idealist rap. Now I'm free to pursue the other course. And it's true that idealism is a very inspiring belief, and that it gives us faith in going on, but it comes at a cost. Everything comes at a cost. The cost of idealism, it requires you to sacrifice your scientific conscience. Yes, you can believe in the freedom of the spirit only if you're willing to accept things that go bump in the dark. Tell me, how much do minds weigh? Where do you find concepts? What color are ideas? Why not just believe in ghosts in the machine? In fact, isn't idealism a belief that there is a ghost in the machine and that human history is not the story of humans, but of that ghost in the machine? So what naturalism offers to you is a preservation of your scientific conscience, a preservation of your scientific heritage. It offers you intellectual conscience. How so? Because it explains human behavior in a law-like fashion. As if, strangely enough, you were animals. And in fact, it seems to me that if you've ever been to a vivisection, we sure do look like animals. We sure do seem to have hearts and brains and neural structures. And if we accept Darwin's thesis, we sure do seem to have come from animals. And at what moment exactly did we stop being animals? At what moment did we step outside of nature and become something other than? So, what naturalism insists, such an incredibly crazy notion, would be something to the effect of that we are actually mammals with extremely complex neural structures, extremely complex larynxes, extended memories, and the ability to communicate. Now, that means that naturalism and we naturalists are forced to treat culture and language instrumentally and behavioralistically, which is always considered reductive by the idealists. But I ask you, how many of you have watched a child learn? When you teach a child a word, do you explain the concept to him first? When you teach him to say mama, do you say, well, first I want to explain the concept of mama, Johnny. Mama is, in fact, the genetic forebearer of your particular person, and mama bears you in the womb for 9 months. So once you get the mama concept, then we'll teach you the mama word. Or do you teach the child mama behavioralistically, the same way you teach a dog to heel? Does he see a certain range of colors and hear the sound mama? And if he says it, he gets smiles and strokes. And if he doesn't, he keeps getting mama. And if he says dada, when he sees that range of colors and experiences that we expect mama, we say, no, Johnny, no. Mama. And then he gets the smile. And then he smiles because he copies it. Now, of course, the idealist will tell us, well, that's because he's achieved a conceptual understanding. That may or may not be. We also know that smiling is a very difficult mechanism, and because it's so painful and uses so many muscles, it releases endorphins. So the child's actually having pleasure when it learns and it smiles. Maybe that's why it remembers it. I have nephews, and I've watched them learn. And they don't seem to be very good with concepts. But if you keep reinforcing them in saying certain words in certain contexts, they'll get them right. For some reason, they can use a word in one context and misuse it in another. I don't think it's because they don't have a conceptual understanding. They just don't have experience with a range of concepts. They watch a video and they see monsters and say, ooh, there's monsters. They go to the playground and say, I saw monsters. Is it that they're obsessed with the monster concept? Or is it that they just haven't learned yet that you don't make that kind of a sound and you don't use your larynx that way when you're at the playground, only when you watch a video? So what we naturalists would argue that there may be some conceptual awareness going on in my nephew's head. It's possible. But at least there is certainly the behavioralistic and instrumental training going on. And if I can explain all of his linguistic activity on those instrumental and behavioral terms, then why do we posit this extra ghost in the machine? Okay. So, how do we treat then, after the child has reached a certain stage, its use of language in an instrumental and naturalistic way? Well, the suggestions have already been made. Don't we, in fact, believe in science not because it, quote, explains? We accept its explanations because it, in fact, allows us to dominate nature. If all of our scientific theories turned out to be incredibly impractical, and belief in ghosts actually worked better in controlling nature, I don't think many of us would ascribe to science. We would probably ascribe to a belief in ghosts. The fact of the matter is, we believe what has helped our species dominate its environment, bring in a greater food supply, and reproduce ourselves. In fact, one way of thinking of human culture would be as if our brain is a sort of hardware, culture is a sort of software. And those programs which allow the hardware units to reproduce themselves most effectively win, just like any other animal. So culture is not something distinct from the rest of nature. It's not a distinct metaphysical realm. It's the particular program, codification of information that this particular animal has. It's different in degree, not in kind. Other animals communicate as well. Dogs exhibit mastery to their leaders of the pack by rolling over on their stomach. As a child, I was guilty of idealism and thought it did it because it wanted to be scratched on its stomach. It doesn't. It's exposing itself to have its throat ripped out, and that expresses to the leader that you are my leader. He used to lick my face, and I thought, oh, that's a doggy kiss. It's not. When dogs are puppies, they feed by licking the face of their mother, and then the mother knows that that means vomit forth dinner for the kid. Now, I never did that. My dog must have been disappointed. It licks your hand. It wants salt. Now, those are very complicated behaviors, and they seem to express emotions. I would urge that they do express emotions, and that human emotions are of the same kind. We're not different from other animals. Most other primates or higher herd mammals have emotion of some sort. It's not a supernatural or extra-physical phenomena. It's an extremely physical phenomena. If we were to do a brain scan, we would undoubtedly find a releasing of endorphins, a releasing of various different chemicals in the brain region. Neurology is a primitive science at this point. But the naturalist must hold that that will be the key to understanding human psychology and, quote, mind. That it is, in fact, a mechanism, like any other mechanism found in the world, that there isn't sort of a separate world out there, but that's nowhere in particular. Naturalism also, it seems to me, has this virtue. It's more likely to produce practical knowledge about what works under what circumstances. A naturalist interpretation of history, because it's law-like, because it doesn't insist that every event is completely unique, because it's a unique development of the spirit, says to us that, yes, when you have a recession and you raise taxes, you produce higher unemployment. It happened this year, it happened this other year, it happened this other year. A law-like regularity. Idealism precludes that because every situation is unique. It's a unique expression of the development of the spirit. At this moment, raising taxes in a recession might actually help produce a growth of human love and prosperity and greater economic activity. If we accept idealism at face value, we are enjoined never to learn anything practical from the past. We are enjoined never to learn what tactics worked at what moment, because the moment's always different. It's developing along different lines. So it's precisely because naturalism rejects that history can be more than just an edifying tale, like a sort of religious sermon on the mount to make us feel good, but it in fact can be a practical discipline, which we can learn from. We tried absolutist arguments on moral grounds. I'm going to take an example off the top of my head. We tried absolutist moral arguments on absolutist grounds in the 1850s, and it produced the Civil War. Must we take the same mistake about, say, the rights of abortion? If we're naturalists, we can learn from the past. We can say, yes, we know what happened when we did that once before, and it led to a bloodbath. Maybe we can learn from that example again. So it's precisely because naturalism rejects the premises of idealism that it offers us a possibility of at least improving our lives, if not feeling better about them. And it's only fair to point out that naturalism does, in fact, offer us no special grounds for hope and no ultimate meaning for the past. But what does that mean from a naturalistic perspective? Okay, it's true. Naturalism may not relieve the terror of history. It may in fact lead to world weariness, as Iliad suggests. But from a naturalistic perspective, what that really means is that we find idealism preferable because it offers us a cultural narcotic. Because it somatizes us to the harsh realities of the world. Because it deadens our brain to an awareness of the difficulties that humans face in our life in the food chain. If that's the grounds for proving one intellectual construction over another, those are pretty thin grounds. One might say the same thing about belief in creationism versus evolutionism. In fact, one does say the same thing about evolutionism versus creationism, and it strikes me from a naturalistic perspective that those are directly analogous. It is deflationary, after all, to believe that you are a monkey's nephew, isn't it? There's something a little less special about being a slightly less furry biped than, say, a chimp, which is a quadruped, or being the only featherless biped on the planet. Okay. Now, I would point out that not only is this deflationary, and that we'll grant that idealism gives us this cultural narcotic, but let's ask a question now. Is that narcotic always good? We know people can take too many narcotics and deaden their brains to the point where they can't judge what they're doing. I ask you to think about this precisely because from a naturalistic perspective, when we think about the sort of consolation that idealist histories give us, they take the form of historical enthusiasms. Now I ask you, what has killed more people in this century? What has filled more mass graves? What has filled more body bags than a belief in idealism? I mean, one of the things that I found perfectly charming about the Persian Gulf War, for example, was that we were fighting that over a very lowbrow principle, the free flow of oil at market prices. We were keeping the price of gas cheap. And a lot of people think that's callous, but that's because they're not naturalists. A naturalist says that's great, because you're not going to kill 10 million people to keep the price of gas down. After 250,000, you're going to stop. But for freedom, how many would you kill for freedom? How many people would you mass murder for democracy or social equality? Stalin thought 20 million was a fine number. And I don't think he was callous and cynical. I think he really believed he was fighting for humanity. And I'll tell you what's scarier. I think Hitler was too. I think that's what idealism can lead to. You get that narcoticized, you don't notice that you're washing your hands in blood. And we've had more historical mass murder in this century than anyone before it. And in fact, we've had more hatred and murder on this planet since the development of historical idealism, and more has come from Westerners, or people trained in this Western discipline, than any time previously. So maybe this narcotic is not such a good thing. Maybe naturalism and the detoxification it offers might be just the ticket. Okay. So to sum up on naturalism, we naturalists, we're a rugged folk. We teach a sort of tough love. A tough love that sobers you up. And it deflates your highest expectations of yourself. But it does so in the belief that maybe, after all, hope is not a virtue, but the last refuge of a scoundrel, of a person who is unwilling to accommodate their behaviors and their emotional proclivities to the realities of the world, which is what we mean by being an adult. So, by deflating our hopes, we in fact are really deflating our infantile wishes. and teaching ourselves that we cannot expect the world to live up to our subjectivities. We must take our subjectivities and train them to be able to accept the realities that surround us. All right, so much for the naturalistic cant. I want now to say that whichever view you take, and I do believe that they are essentially contestable views, and I don't believe you can make a case for either one. I don't think one case beats the other. I think they're each equally tenable, and it's really a question of what each particular person needs and wants. Either way, however, I do think you can't help feel that there is a fundamental value to historical knowledge, whether you're an idealist, a naturalist, a skeptic, or whatnot. Certainly, everyone must agree that if anything teaches us the causes of how things have come to be the way they are today, it's history. If understanding ourselves means understanding how we became what we are, then certainly the only way to get that is history. And we find that not only for societies and nations and civilizations, but as people. When we try to understand why we are the sort of person we are, we think about the things that have happened to us. And that is history. In fact, the historical method underlines and is used in all diagnosis, not only psychological, but medical. Think about what you tell a doctor when he asks you about your symptoms. Well, what have you eaten lately? What have you been doing? Your neck hurts you? Have you been straining it? Have you been walking around on a lectern giving lectures, spinning your head back and forth? This is sort of a question a doctor asks, and it's an historical question. The historical method underlies all our parts of diagnosis, not just medical, not just psychological, but practical as well. Gee, I'm having a problem with my kids. Well, what's been happening? Tell me about it. So it's an indispensable part of everyday life. That's part of the value of history. It reveals to us the accumulated actions of our species. And if that doesn't afford us self-knowledge, then I think we have to conclude that self-knowledge is impossible. If we can't learn who we are from what our ancestors have done, then we can never know who we are. And if history can't help us understand the world we're in, then we're truly lost. If there's a better way of understanding what's going on in Yugoslavia today than a history of that region for the last 700 years, if there's a better way of understanding it, then we don't know it. Certainly, history is the only hope we have for understanding the world around us. And not only that, if we are to have a sense of the options facing us in terms of action and behavior, certainly that must come from an understanding of the nature of what exists. So I don't see how we could even hope to act without an awareness of the past. If we, as one scholar put it, he who forgets the lessons of history is forever condemned to repeat them, to relive them. He who forgets the mistakes made in the past will make them over and over. Finally, I want to conclude with this thought. Whether one of the aforementioned perspectives at some point in our future will come to dominate at the others, at the expense of the other, is a question we cannot be indifferent to. We characterize ourselves, we define ourselves not only on the basis of our past, but on the basis of the way we think about that past. If we think about ourselves as the result of a particular biological evolution that has developed various techniques, we have less of a reason to treasure those beliefs. We have a much more tenuous sense of our identities in cultural terms, though perhaps stronger in other terms. Similarly, if we're idealists and we believe that our beliefs are a result and our thoughts are a result of a process of dialectical unfolding of a set of fundamental principles and ideals, we are likely to hold on to those and cherish them far more than we otherwise would. So we cannot be indifferent, in fact, to the past or to the various interpretations of the past. Perhaps nothing tells us so much about not only who we are, but who we want to be, as the different strategies of interpreting the past and the different pasts. But finally, I want to say, in accord with my own practice as an historian, whether our culture will become idealist or naturalist is something we can only know in the future. It will only be a subject for future historians. I conclude with my paraphrase from Hegel: the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the setting of dusk. This is a decision which each of us must make for ourselves.